He had a cousin living with him then that was my friend that we double dated in high school. And she worked here in town and boarded with them. And so she said that Red says he'll take us to the movie Saturday night. Do you want to go? And I said, yes, I'll go to the movie. But I tell him I'm not interested in a relationship. We're just going to the movie. And that's how it started. My name is Phyllis Hazle. I was born on August the 20th, 1934. My parents were Margaret Pringle and Alonzo Wood Wagner. My father, when he and my mother first married, he worked in the Bowmore and Lampkin hardware store in Magnolia. And then they later moved to Buffalo and owned a restaurant in Buffalo. And then about 1929 or 1930, they moved to Hammondsville and bought the general store there. And they had a post office, and my father was postmaster. And then they had a general store, and they bought cream and eggs. They moved from the store about 1931 or 32 and bought my grandfather's farm and moved to the house on 357. Our house was in LaRue County, but our barn was in Hart County. I had 3 older brothers, a younger sister, and then a younger brother. We raised tobacco and corn and Angus beef cattle. We had 2 big gardens. A spring garden was on the left and our fall garden was on the right. And my mother and us girls spent the summer canning and preserving and making preserves and jams and jellies and getting things ready so we ate well. And of course I remember when I grew up, we slaughtered our meat. We'd get a first cold, 2 or 3 cold spells we'd have. My dad, they'd heat up the scalding tub and kill hogs. And the first time, they just kill 1 or 2. And then 2 or 3 people would get together and they'd take them. And then when it got colder, well, they'd do more. My dad always did about 4 more. And then we salted the meat down in what we call the meat box in the smokehouse until it had stayed long enough to what they call cure, and then take it out of the meat box and hang it up. And then whenever you wanted meat, you'd go to the meat house and take your butcher knife and cut off a big slice of Joel bacon or a piece of country ham or whatever you wanted, you know. And then of course we had our own chickens, so we had that. And then every now and then somebody in the neighborhood would kill a beef, and the neighbors would all divide it up. And it was a real treat to get beef, you know. But we all ate well because we had all the canned vegetables. My mother even raised her dried beans. She'd pick them and put them in a bushel basket and set them in the sun, and the sun would pop them out. She wouldn't have to hull them. Then she'd put them in a big flour sack and hang them up in the meat house. Back then, you had the corn thresher. He'd be at one neighbor's one day. Everybody would go there. The women would go and cook for everybody. And then the next day, the wheat thresher, the next day they'd go to the next neighbor. Same thing happened, and like that, they'd go on. And the same way with the corn shredder and all of those. And the neighbor ladies would help cook, and the men would work. My dad had a certain group of about 6 or 7 that they worked together like that all the time. When they had anything that was going to be much of a very big job, they all helped each other. Sometimes the wheat threshers, the guys played music, and maybe they would stay at your house at night, and they'd get together after supper and play music and just have a real good time. We farmed with horses. My father loved horses. He would break and train horses for other people. And then, of course, the war came along, and you couldn't buy anything much. And we bought a big Alsever tractor right after the war. It was huge. We thought we really had a big piece of machinery. And it wasn't long until we bought our first new car. And I think we paid $700 and some for it. My father died when he was 41. He had heart problems and he had asthma. And he'd been to Glasgow to the hospital and had just come home. And then he took pneumonia and died. Of course, there were no such thing as antibiotics then in 42 or 43. That was before, they weren't used until after World War II. My mom worked outside and worked in the garden a lot, so I was given a good chore of helping cook and do laundry and all those things. I learned to make, cornbread was the first thing I learned to make when I was about 12. And then Mom would come in and start a meal and she'd say, here, you finish up. So I would make a pie or a cobbler or something and make the cornbread and finish up our noon meal at lunch, which we had a big meal at noon then. But we used to take our corn, our white corn, to Buffalo to Mr. Keith and have our corn meal ground and take our wheat and have flour and whole wheat made. And I could always remember Mom would make whole wheat muffins when we got back from the mill, and oh, they were always so good. We had the Miller roller mills. Of course, we had the telephone exchange. We had a barber shop. We had a place that bought cream and eggs from the farmers, a garage, a welding shop, 2 or 3 grocery stores, of course the post office, the funeral home, a dry goods store, and a couple of little convenience stores. And it was, you could get about anything you really, that was necessary in the little town. And then we had 2 or 3 service stations in town. There was a gas station north and there was a gas station south. One on the right-hand side and one on the left-hand side, but they were both in the very edge as you came into town. But when they rebuilt the L&N Turnpike, they bypassed Magnolia. Well, you know what happens when they bypass a town. And of course we had 2 churches. We had the Presbyterian and the Baptist church, and everybody attended both of them. You were always welcome. And when they had revivals at those churches, they would let out school, and the whole school would go to church at the 11 o'clock service. We'd walk from the school to the churches. We didn't go to Hodgenville very often because we could get most of what we needed in Magnolia. We didn't have the need to have to go to Hodgenville. It was just kind of a special treat to get to go. We'd all kind of, each one would try to see who was chosen to go that day. I remember the day that Pearl Harbor was bombed on December the 7th, 1941. We had been to Magnolia to my grandfather's that Sunday afternoon. We usually went there after church on Sunday, or they came to our house one. Mostly after he got older, we went to his house on Sunday afternoon. And we came home from Magnolia, where he lived, and my 2 older brothers ran out of the house to meet us. And they had heard it on the radio that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor and told us. Of course, I was not old enough to realize the gravity of what had happened then. My next to the oldest brother was drafted near the end of World War II. The oldest brother got a deferment because of my father being dead and having to take care of the farm. So we had pictures made of the family because we didn't have any pictures of the whole family. We went and had pictures made with him in his uniform. And then he was on a ship on the way to Japan when the Japanese surrendered. So he went on and went to Japan, and they put him to work in the post office in Tokyo. I went to church at 3 Forks of Bacon Creek in Hammondsville. It was on 357. The pastor was there for 30-some years. He baptized our whole family, all 6 of us kids, and married 4 of us, I believe. When my father died in 42, we couldn't get to the cemetery at Bacon Creek because it was a dirt road, and he died in February, and the roads were too muddy, and for us to go, so we had to bury him in the cemetery at Magnolia, which turned out to be okay. It was called Bacon Creek because during the Civil War, the people who lived around there hid their bacon in the creek to keep the soldiers from taking it. So that's how it got its name, as Bacon Creek. I went to school all 12 years at Magnolia. There had been a one-room school close to us, but it had closed, and I went all 12 years at Magnolia to school. First, second, and third grade was in one room, and a third, fourth, and fifth was in one room. So your third graders helped your second and first graders with their homework and things. Size-wise, I think it was about a 5 or 6 room building, plus a principal's office. And the first year or two I went, we didn't even have indoor restrooms. Then one summer they added on, and we had indoor restrooms then. And then a little later, they added a lunchroom in the basement of the building. When I first started to school, you had to take your lunch. And then they fixed a lunchroom in the basement. And I didn't eat in the lunchroom very much because it was 10 cents to eat. And then later I did. And then when I got in high school, I worked in the lunchroom the period before lunch for my lunch. And at that time, the government had bought up a big load of cherries. And each school got a large allotment of cherries. So we ended up having cherry pie almost every day. Until this day, I do not like cherry pie. We always had a good basketball team when Mr. Reed was there. And matter of fact, in '47, the basketball team went to the state tournament. And the team that won was the team that knocked Magnolia out of the tournament. There wasn't 10 people left in Magnolia the day that they played. Everybody in Magnolia went to Louisville to the ball game. I graduated in 1952. After I got out of school, the first summer and the summer before, I spent working for the Kentucky Baptist Sunday School Board. We went into churches that had never had a vacation Bible school and taught them how to have a Bible school. And the state Sunday School Board paid me $15 a week. I don't think anybody else much got paid, but I did. And like I say, we go into a church that never had a vacation Bible school. That was the beginning of vacation Bible school, was the early 50s. And we'd go into a church that had never had one and have one. Sometimes we'd go to a church in the morning, and then we'd go to another one in the afternoon and show them how to have a vacation Bible school. And in September, I started to work at the LaRue County Health Department. And I worked there until right up just before Red and I were married. My husband's full name was Charles Ray Hazle. No one called him Charles. Everybody called him Red. And of course, he was known for that throughout his life. He was born in September 1926. He was born at Maxine. Maxine's a little town on 357 between Hodgenville and Mumfordville. His dad started a little country store there in the early 20s. His dad went to school at Bryan and Stratton Business School, back then is what it was called. And he came home and he told the family, said, "We're spelling our name wrong. We're spelling it Hazel, which is a girl's first name." So all of Red's dad's family changed the spelling in their name to Hazle. And his father opened that store there when he got through with Bryan and Stratton. And he said he had this little country store, and he thought he was set to open and thought he had everything that anybody would want. He was so proud of himself as to what he had done. He opened it, and the first person that came in the next morning wanted a bottle of turpentine, and he didn't have it. And then, a short time later, he moved to Tanner and opened up a country store at Tanner, which was larger. And then they built a new brick house there right beside the Tanner store. And they lived there during Red's school years mostly. He graduated from Hodgenville High School, I think in 43 or 44. During the time from whenever he graduated from high school, he helped his dad in the store here in town, because after his dad was a tanner, then he ended up at the beginning of World War II, he moved to Hodgenville and opened up a grocery store and general store, and then was able to sell farm implements. And so he helped his dad there. And then when the Korean War came up, he was one of the first ones that got called up because he had missed World War II. He carried a BAR rifle, and the rifle and all the equipment weighed more than he did. Of course, at that time, he only weighed about 127 pounds. So he had a little Korean school teacher that was his ammo barrier that went with him everywhere he went. So when they went out on patrol, he was the first man out and the last man in. And there was 9 of them went out one day, and he and one other was all that came back. So he had some harrowing experiences in Korea. When we started going together, he had just come back from Korea. And that was one reason I went out with him the first time, because he was still trying to adjust to civilian life, and he was having a hard time. Red and I had really always known each other. My father and his mother went to school together, and his dad and my dad used to hunt together. And his brother married the girl that lived next door to me. So I can't remember meeting. It seems like I always knew him and knew the family, you know. And when he asked me out the first time, I was surprised, because he was a friend of my brother's, and I had never thought of him in that way. And when he asked me out, he had a cousin living with him then that was my friend that we double dated in high school. And she worked here in town and boarded with them. And so she said that Red says he'll take us to the movie Saturday night. Do you want to go? And I said, yes, I'll go to the movie. But I tell him I'm not interested in a relationship. We're just going to the movie. And that's how it started. But when we got back from the movie, he took her home and then took me home. And then asked me for a date, and I said yes. And then all that summer, I never dated but one other person, and he never had but one other date. And I had other guys ask me, but I found myself saying no. And then that was in February when we first started going together. And then in September, on his birthday, the 30th of September, we went to Nolin, down by Nolin River. There was a fellow that had a fish shop down there, and he had excellent whole catfish. He and I went down there for his birthday, and we were talking, and he asked me, he says, what do you want out of life? And I remember telling him I want a home and a family and children. And then he asked me to marry him. And I said yes. And then we were married in December of 1954. We were married in Barren Run Church, because my church at Bacon Creek was having it was a New Year's Eve, and they were having a New Year's Eve service. So my church was taken. So we were married in his church by my pastor, and his pastor was best man. I think until about 58 or 59 was when he moved across the street to what used to be a laundry. And so Red's dad bought the building from his Uncle Irvin Duckworth, who was Red's dad's half-brother, bought the building from Albert Hubbard, and he was a brother-in-law of Albert Hubbard. And so at that time, Red took a one-day sale of what they sold, the money that they sold one day, and that's what his seed money was for the farm supply to get started there. and Red took the feed, and that was the very beginning of lawnmowers and chainsaws and things like that. And so Red took the feed, the chainsaws and things, and light hardware, and moved there in the old laundry building. The garage was across the street where they had worked on tractors. Well, they fixed a certain portion of that room off for Red to have to use to work on lawnmowers and chainsaws and things like that. So that part was our garage. And I stayed home for the first 10 years we were married. I didn't work at the store. I would sometimes take the books home with me and work at the kitchen table on charge books and things and send out statements. But I didn't go to the store to work until later. We sold all kinds of garden plants that you can transplant. And of course in the spring, a lot of different things. And in the fall, of course, cabbage and broccoli and cauliflower was about all you could do in the fall. But in the spring, we'd start out with cold crops and then go into squash and different. We carried about 20 to 25 different varieties of tomatoes. I had people come from 3 and 4 counties for tomatoes. And if somebody wanted some kind of beans and I didn't have them, I'd get them for them. I'd go to Louisville to the seed companies real early in the morning. I'd be there when they opened, and I would have called my order in the day before, and they'd load me up, and then I'd be back in Hodgenville by 8:30 or 9 o'clock. So I could get, if you only wanted a cup of beans, I could get it for you. If you wanted 10 pounds, I could get it for you. In the early years of our marriage, he ran for city council. He was on city council about 4 terms, about 4 two-year terms. And how he got paid was we got our water bill paid every month, which was $3 or $4 a month. For several years, he was not on the city council. And then he was for about, I'd say maybe 8 or 10 years there whenever Clayton Owens was mayor. And then several people approached him and wanted him to run for mayor against Clayton Owens. So he did, and he won that election in the 70s up to, I think, 80 or 81 he was mayor. He ran the second time, but his dad had died a few days before, and Red was sick himself, and he didn't get to get out and campaign. So he got beat by 12 votes the second time he ran. He enjoyed his time as mayor. Of course, it took time away from the business, and it made it harder on me for him to be gone, because sometimes I had to make decisions that had to be made right then and there that I was not comfortable with, maybe. But nothing big happened, so I guess it turned out okay. My husband had a stroke in April 2014, and then he went from the hospital to the nursing home. He was there about 2 months, and then we were able to bring him home. But after Red had the stroke, he never went back in the store, not ever, which I was glad, because I knew it'd be hard on him to go, and he never went back in. Then in October, we closed the store. The next spring then, we had a spring and summer. We had 2 or 3 sidewalk sales and going out of business sales and so forth. And we finally got rid of all of it. And then we were able to sell both buildings privately, and which was good. And then I went home to stay and spent time with the children's help, taking care of him. My oldest daughter was Catherine Ross, who everybody knows as a teacher. And my second daughter is Connie Baker, who's a nurse. And then my last was our son, Chuck, who's a physical therapy professor at UK. The first of all is what you can buy with $1. That changed the world. Our morals have changed. and our standard of living. See, when I grew up, nobody had a bathroom in the house. Everybody had outdoor toilets. And then I think our culture has changed. I think it changed after World War II. It changed after Vietnam, and I think it has changed now. I think as a generation, we're responsible to try to make the next generation better than the one before.